Welcome to Frankly Speaking with Lynne Franks and Friends. I'm Lynne Franks, your host, and today I'm talking with Stella Creasy MP for Walthamstow. We will talk to her about what it's like being a feminist and an outspoken campaigner in Westminster, about her recent campaigns and how we can all make positive changes in our communities. During such disruptive times when so many of us have been forced to stay in our own areas, there has been a rise in community engagement and also a visibility of the issues in our immediate neighbourhoods that we may not have had the time to look at in quite the same way before. Stella has been a tireless champion for those in her community of Walthamstow, and she has helped people across the UK for over a decade now on various causes, from working to end violence against women, which is how we met with 1 Billion Rising quite some time ago, to criticising the absurd tampon tax. I am so pleased she made time to join this podcast for me to interview her, and I hope this interview inspires you to find all the ways of connecting with your communities in new ways. So, since 2010, Stella has served as an MP for Walthamstow, fighting for the community and their causes. She is a mother and a feminist in Westminster, a tireless campaigner and an incredibly effective activist. And we are so very grateful to you, Stella Creasy MP, for joining us here today. And how are you? And I know exactly because you just told me before we started, so congratulations. Great news.
Yes, I'm halfway through my second pregnancy. So with a small child as well, I'm at that level where I'm really, really missing caffeine. I have to be honest about it.
What you're going to say then, I say missing campaigning. And of course, being at home, well, for all of us, it's been such a change. Especially with Westminster, which looks like a ghost town anytime I happen to see it on the news. So what's it been like for you actually campaigning from home, still being an MP in Westminster? How does it all work?
Yeah, it's been difficult because the move to having online engagement in Parliament has come at a cost of being able to debate. So although we can make speeches online into the chamber, we can't follow up questions, we can't ask ministers about things they said, we can't query them. It's also quite interesting just in terms of the way in which it's been managed. And I would say it from all sides of the political spectrum. It's definitely been a boon for the whip's offices, I think, to be able to manage who gets to speak when and how often people can speak and making sure things finish. But look, you know, we've had a pandemic. It would be insane to bring the thousands of people who come together in Westminster together on a daily basis when you're trying to get people to socially distance. So something had to give. I think the challenge for all of us is what comes next, because I had a glorious evening where I spoke on a debate, something I felt very passionate about immigration. I voted on it, and I also did bedtime and bath time with my daughter, all from the same sort of location. And if we're talking about how we make Westminster more accessible and we make political engagement more accessible, being able to fit it in with normal family life is a really key concern. So as much as there's been some downsides to the online engagement, there's also some potential upsides. I think it would be a shame if we lost them. Sadly, the person who has responsibility for leading that conversation is one Jacob Rees-Mogg, who doesn't really have much of an ear to how you might engage families, because he can't understand why everybody doesn't have a nanny.
It doesn't have a nanny, I was about to say.
So it's been a battle that we're having in Parliament,
actually,
about how we learn from what we've had over the last year in terms of online engagement, but also make sure that we can have the debates and discussions and challenge necessary for good decision making.
Well, it's always been such a challenge for women MPs for all the years I've been involved with Westminster, because of that very thing about it's a choice. You either see your children and you're involved with helping them grow up. And of course, it's a choice for a lot of business women, or has been in the past, or you work from home, which has not been possible. Now it is. It's going to be a very interesting time to see how that rolls out. But it hasn't kept you quiet. I must say, the one thing I find very worrying from what you said, and clearly from your perspective as well, is this lack of debate. Because there are a number of bills that are going through, and I want to talk about that a little bit later on, which in normal times I would be very surprised if they weren't completely challenged in every way. So it's not healthy, this lack of debate, clearly.
Well, but don't forget, that's not necessarily due to the pandemic. I mean, the government does have an 80-seat majority, and actually that's, in our political history, relatively unusual. I came into Parliament with in 2010 when it became the coalition government. We then had Theresa May with a very narrow majority, but now things are very different. So it's not all about the pandemic. Look, that's why voting and participating in elections matters, because when you are the government, you get to set what's on the agenda, and you get, especially if you've got a majority like that, to push things through. So it's a challenge for people like me, who've actually always worked across the House, because I've always believed that if you're comfortable and confident in the things that you care about, I'm incredibly ideological, but I'm not tribal. I know why I'm in the Labour movement, but I will talk to everybody and anybody about the causes and communities that I care about, because that's how you make progress. It just means you have to reassess how you work. So I'm doing a lot of work at the moment with members of the House of Lords, because in the House of Lords the numbers are slightly different, and that's allowing us to get debates and discussions to come back to the House of Commons. Good example of that is something I'm working on right now about misogyny is hate crime, and also the stalking register. For years we've been told that lessons will be learned every time a woman is killed by somebody who's a repeat offender. It's very clear that the existing system doesn't work, and we would like there to be a explicit register of serial perpetrators and stalkers. I mean, I think of cases like Shana Grice, who was in fact fined for wasting police time before she was murdered by her stalker, a man who had stalked 13 other women. There's a lot of patterns in these kind of crimes, and the brilliant Laura Richards, who is the world expert as far as I'm concerned about this, has always called for a stalking register. We weren't able to get anywhere on that in the Commons in trying to get the government, having previously supported the idea. Theresa May supported the idea, they've now reneged on it. But in the Lords we were, and so last night we won a vote in the Lords for the proposal, which is going to come back to the Commons on Monday. For people like me,
congratulations, that's absolutely brilliant, because I got your text about that last night, because I'm on your list, obviously. And this whole idea of using Twitter, social media and texting was used by you from the beginning, because you're a modern woman of today, and I think you caught on to the
pictures, Lynn. That's why I like social media. I always enjoy a good animal video.
But you were texting me about, and millions of other people, about your campaigns for years, long before people realised that that was a very effective way of getting people to put the word out there, and by putting the word out there to put pressure on in some way or another. And there's been some amazing campaigns that you've got through by that, and you've always seen the way through strategically. Actually, before we get to that, I want to ask you what brought you into the House of Commons in the first place? What was the inspiration, and what were you doing before, and how did you get there? Because I've never asked you that before.
I've always said that the blame lies with my parents, and in fact they have to live with it because they live in the constituency that I represent, although they always say it's not their fault. As a young child, I was always very struck by a sense of injustice about the world, and I would say, why is the world like this? And they'd say, well, what are you going to do about it? They say they've lived to regret asking me that question, having now ended up with me as their MP. I think a sense of social injustice. I came from a faith background. My mum was very involved in the local church. My parents are activists in their own right within our local community.
I have actually met your parents.
Yes, you know it's all true.
Well, we were all campaigning in Trafalgar Square about violence against women years ago, so I know it's true.
But I think that idea that it wasn't enough to have an analysis that the world was unfair, you had to take action, has always been an issue for me. So I was a youth worker before I got elected. I'd been a local councillor. I'd always enjoyed working with people, and I'd always thought it isn't about one person, it's about what many people can achieve. I had actually stood down from local government because I was in my 20s and I was trying to write a PhD. My academic background's in psychology. I was trying to do a job, and I was trying to be a counsellor, and I didn't really have much of a social life. And in my 20s, I kind of thought that was important. But then the local MP, who was somebody I'd worked with as well, said he was retiring. And you get to a point where you think, well, this is the community I really care about. These are causes I'm really passionate about. If I don't stand up and say, well, actually, I could do this, you will always regret it. These opportunities come along very rarely in your life. And so I had the opportunity to represent the community that I care about and fight for the causes that I'm passionate about.
Well, two key words there that I know is absolutely true, which is the care and the passion. And I have to say that, again, with my more cynical hat on for a lot of politicians, they go into constituencies they've probably never even visited before because they're safe seats and they're not involved in the community. I won't say all, but I would say a fair amount.
But the one thing I would say is, look, if all I can offer to politics is my postcode, that's not enough. So absolutely understanding and respecting and being interested in the community that you are from is important, but it's not enough. I mean, there are lots of brilliant people who care passionately about their local areas, but for whom politics isn't quite the right place for them. And that's okay. What I want to do is move away from a politics where we elect 650 people into a place that looks like Hogwarts gone wrong and then expect them to be these kind of mafia dons. And look, I think one of the things that worries me about the existing political debate now is that people expect politicians to be biased, and they expect us to be this kind of mafia don, you vote for me, I scratch your back, you scratch, rather than having values and ideas and being able to think about the whole country as well. I think Walthamstow is God's own country. I know you might disagree with me from where you're based at the moment.
Well, I love Somerset, but I do think Walthamstow is very special.
But I also know that Walthamstow does best when the UK does best, when Europe does best, when the world does best. So actually, it's not about trading one off against the other. And in that politics where people expect you to be a kind of mafia don fixing problems for them on the basis that they will fix things for you, somebody's going to lose out. And actually, I don't want a politics of losers. I think we all win when we all do well. That's why I'm a socialist. I want to get the best out of each of us for the benefit of all of us. But our politics at the moment isn't really set up to be like that. So it's quite a frustrating, long-winded, bureaucratic, and quite small c conservative way of working. And you always have to have that, put it more simply, my mum's always saying to me, it's not about you, and she's right. And if you have that in your head, you're always thinking, well, how else can we make change happen? How else can we get even more out of each other in the time we have available to each other? That's the hopeful, exciting conversation to have. Sitting on green benches, listen to the same speech being given 3 different ways, and I would include myself in that, is not the most exciting thing to do, I promise you.
I know, I couldn't even imagine doing it. And what drives you? I imagine it's a passion for the causes that you follow and that you drive, are the ones driving you. I mean, what keeps you going? Now you've got 2 children you're going to have.
I've always been somebody who wanted to do something about the injustice that I saw. So even as a little kid, I always tell the story about one of the best lessons I learned in campaigning. So I was at an all-girls school in Colchester, and I was very involved in the campaign around Nestle providing baby milk in developing countries and the negative impact that was having. And so I managed to persuade all my friends at school that we should boycott Nestle. And I was very excited, and I won this argument with people. And so the school took all of the Nestle products out of the chocolate machine. And it was one of the best lessons in campaigning I learned, because for one day, we've made a point about how we could support our sisters in developing countries. And then I realized at an all-girls school, there was no chocolate in the chocolate machine. And you can imagine how quickly people stopped supporting the campaign. And it taught me a strong lesson about the importance of always thinking ahead about what should happen next. And, now I'm middle-aged, I still like to think I have some of that spirit left in me. Actually, I would say I'm even more determined now than I used to be, because when I was younger and when I first became a councillor and then an MP, it was always a bit theoretical what you could actually make happen. Now I've seen how change happens, and sometimes how it takes a long time, and some of the compromises and the negotiations that go along with it, but also that, brilliant things can spin off it. So I've fought for women in Northern Ireland to have equal access to abortion. One of the things that makes me proudest now is the connections and the support we have within the wider women's sector in Northern Ireland, to give them the confidence to be heard in their own right, and to see them doing all sorts of amazing things and know that we helped support them and show them that their voices should be heard.
Yes.
And you think that's absolutely brilliant. I'm not for 1 second claiming credit for what they're doing. I just mean to be able to have been part of changing the narrative that said that you can't be heard, this process is dead to you, seeing them come forward. And that
actually there was always some amazing
Northern
Ireland. I remember when the peace processes were going on, there was a Northern Ireland Women's Peace Coalition, which was extraordinary, made up of social workers, school teachers, housewives, who came together and had a lot of say in what was going on behind the scenes. But of course, they never had the front of house power that I suppose that they have now in a way. But of course, they're going to need it, because it's certainly, as we've been reading, not all finished there yet. So some of the campaigns that there's so many campaigns you've worked on, as you say, the abortion in Northern Ireland was a big one. Let's talk a bit about the tampon tax, because I was actually quite interested. I got something through the post from our local district council this week saying there is funding available to do projects with women in communities, particularly who have suffered, you probably know about this, who particularly suffered from the pandemic and with mental health issues and domestic violence and isolation. And the money has come from the tampon tax, which I thought was quite interesting.
Yes, George Osborne thought he was playing a PR blinder by giving us back our tax that we were overpaying on tampons because they were being treated as a luxury item. The tampon tax it's really funny, actually, because I first sort of became aware of that and stood up on that when I was a teenager. And in fact, when the local MP came to my school, I almost got excluded because the head teacher told me if I caused any more fuss, she would exclude me, challenging the then MP about it. Little did I know that 20 years later, I would be in the chamber in Parliament where that same MP, a gentleman called Bernard Jenkins, who's a Conservative MP, would get up and say, 20 years ago, a young sixth former had a go at me about this, and now I support it, because obviously from his perspective, it was a good example of what he thought was wrong with Europe. From my perspective, it's not the Europeans who invented treating tampons as a luxury item. We used to do that before we joined the European Union, but we found common cause. So it's a funny one in terms of, and he would acknowledge that it was that conversation 20 years ago that kind of alerted him to that issue. And one of the things I would say to people is, you know, it can be amazing if you speak up. What
Just
happens.
about to say, for a
immediately,
yes,
but you plant seeds. And that's, again, the thing that makes me sad about our political process at the moment is we expect everybody in Parliament to have all the answers, to be right all the time, and then to just defend the status quo come what may. And so being able to, I mean, sometimes people will start conversations with me and they'll say like, of course, you know about Water Regulation X. And I'm thinking, I didn't sit that exam. I don't know about it. Tell me about it. Let's have a conversation. And we might not agree at the end of it, but you've made me think and you'll have informed what I do next. Our political process isn't set up for that.
I get the feeling sometimes that many MPs, and actually Bernard Jenkins, I watched him, for example, last week on Question Time, are really just geared up to know what to answer and how to answer Question Time questions on subjects they don't really have much to do with, and that's their sort of prime focus, really. I don't know.
I always say I've never had a good idea on my own, right? I benefit from the conversations I have at a local, national, and indeed international level in making me think. And again, I think you have to be confident in your ideology. So you have to know what you're passionate about, what your fundamental values are, but being open to how you get there, and therefore that there might be something that you don't know that somebody else knows. I fought, one of the first campaigns I fought when I was elected was about payday lending. And when I first started campaigning on that, and the legal loan sharks I could see popping up in my community everywhere, the Wongas, the
yeah.
Oakums, all these people, I was fighting for an interest rate cap. And lots of people said to me, no, I won't support you because that's the wrong thing to do. Now, you know, traditional politics says, right, well, then we've got a fight on our hands. What I did was to ask people why they thought it was wrong. And actually the arguments they made about how lenders would put the charges elsewhere, so it was pointless, were really helpful. That's what came to the idea eventually came up with, was a cap on all forms of charging. So to make sure there wasn't a loophole that these companies could claw the money back from. If we hadn't have had that conversation, if people hadn't told me I was wrong, but why, and we'd had that conversation, then we'd have been stuck fighting for something that wouldn't have worked as well.
And you're still very much behind that whole campaign, because you're retailers, which is the buy now, pay later.
Yes, and now
ethos.
The thing about these industries is that, you know, exploitation in financial services is like water. It tries to find a way through. So now we have these new companies called Klarna and ClearPay and Laybuy who offer people the opportunity to spread payments, but of course people end up spending more than they intended to. That's where these companies make their money, with the retailers. So we've got a lot of people getting into debt with them because what they thought was a £30 pair of trainers is actually worth £120, and they haven't got that money. So we've won the argument with the government that these companies should be regulated because they weren't, and now we're fighting for what those regulations should be. You know, it's a good example of where, like the chocolate machine, you can't just stop and go, brilliant, I've got rid of the Kit Kats, because the next day something else is going to happen, and then people will be exploited. You know, I see so many people, especially during the pandemic, who come to me who are in real dire financial straits. And it's not just about the money, it's about the impact that has on their families, it's about the impact it has on their mental health, on their confidence and on their future. And if we can stop these companies from exploiting people, we can stop that happening in the first place, rather than just dealing with the consequences of it afterwards. Mm-hmm. So we build a better chocolate machine with fair trade chocolate in it from everywhere. That's what I
Yeah,
wanted.
in fact, I think it was you, I'm pretty sure it was you actually, it was London Fashion Week, which I have been going on about for ages, has got to be changed, because I set it up, you know, I don't know, 30 odd years ago, and it's completely out of sync, I think, with what really is going on in the world. And that was where they had, was it Clear Pay actually is one of their sponsors? And you could have,
they've actually got them on the board.
oh my God.
Yeah,
I also,
they wrote me a very rude email, a letter back saying, how dare I criticize them, and this was helping people make fashion more affordable. And I just thought, you just don't get it.
That's outrageous.
You know,
well, I put some
based
stuff
on
out
getting
there.
people into debt, that's not a good place to be.
And to have, I mean, if they're so desperate for sponsors that they've got to have a company like that as one of their sponsors, I just think the whole of Fashion Week's got to take a very serious look at itself, stop, pause, and say, okay, where are we going from here? It's
But do you know what, Lynn? It's a great example. So look, I can try and table stuff in Parliament, and don't get me wrong, I have a platform as an MP that I'm trying to use, but actually everybody listening to this, anyone can make a stand on these things and can help inform other people. Like, a lot of people don't realise the risks in buy now, pay later. And one of the things I've always thought in politics is that everybody has power, but we don't always talk about how people can use that. So we sideline the public and we say it's just about the mafia don in Westminster and whether they pick things up. And so you think, well, that creates an impossible job to do, but it also denies the power and agency we all have as consumers, as, you know, fellow citizens, to say to people, actually, this isn't fashionable. This isn't how fashion should work.
I mean, absolutely, the late great Anita Roddick, Body Shop, used to talk about the dollar vigilantes, and we all can be vigilantes as consumers, and it is primarily women that make the decisions on what we're going to buy, and we can use that vote, that dollar vote, that pound vote, in a very smart way if we actually do declare, like Fashion Revolution, set up by my friend Ursula de Castro, who I interviewed here a few weeks ago, says, let's ask where our clothes are made, how they're made, what harm is it doing to the environment, how people are being exploited in the manufacturing, and let's make a conscious decision that we want something beautiful to wear, but let's make it something, and not just what we wear, but what we eat and what we buy for our homes is made in a fair way. We women have that power. We can all use it, and I'm all for it, I must say. So I agree with you entirely. But fashion, because that's my background, I feel very passionate about that really we've got to learn learn how to do it, learn about our power, really. So the other things that you're pushing out is amendments in the domestic abuse bill, making misogyny a hate crime, which you got through the House of Lords a few weeks ago. Congratulations on that. Now, again, you're looking, as you said earlier, about the index of actually creating an index, and that went through last night, which is fantastic news. I want to talk.
We now have to win those arguments in the Commons, because the way
I just assume you've won them now.
Not yet.
Well,
Caitlin Moran brilliantly always told me to put the word yet at the end of sentences, and she's absolutely right. So, you know, you say, I haven't done this yet, and it changes your mindset, but that you're going to do it, you just might need to keep working at it.
I'm a great believer in manifestation, the power of the mind. So I wanted to talk to you about the covert human intelligence sources that you've also started campaigning on, which I find incredibly worrying. Do you want to explain a bit about what that means?
Yeah, so I mean, actually this legislation has now become law. And I mean, the first thing I'd say is we do need legislation, because this stuff had already been happening. So the police, our secret services, had been recruiting people to be intelligence sources, essentially to spy for them, for many years, but there were no rules and regulations about how they were doing it. So we always wanted a piece of legislation to formalise that and to put protections in. The issue for me was whether it had the right protections in and whether there were other things that needed to be in it. And in particular, when people talk about this, they tend to think about, like, James Bond, when you talk about spies, or people might be aware of the cases involving the police who formed a relationship with women. But very few people realise that children have been used as covert human intelligence sources, essentially, so to spy. And actually that's been increasing because children have been involved in more serious crime. In particular, in a community like mine, I see a lot of it with the county lines issue. So children getting involved in drug dealing and being used and exploited because they're vulnerable kids, but also then being approached by the police to help inform on the people they're in. And we should be really clear, this legislation was about giving people permission to commit criminal activity as part of helping an investigation. So when it came to children, we're talking about children being encouraged to do criminal things in order, and to stay in places of risk, because of course it's incredibly dangerous for a child to be in that place, in order to help an investigation. Now, thankfully, it happens very rarely, but I worked with an organisation, brilliant organisation called Just for Kids, to try and get into the bill, because there was nothing in the bill when it was first written, proper protections and safeguards for children. Because, I mean, you might say, look, well, surely we should just never, ever use a child in that way. But this also covered things like children perhaps going into an off license and buying alcohol. And that's something I think people would recognise as a thing that happens, that you do that to test that people are following the law. So we had to find a way through about making sure that if you were ever going to ask a child to do that, there were people there who could protect their interests. Because a lot of the times the police have conversations with the children on their own. So there's nobody else there to kind of act as a check and balance. And that also, it was only ever in an exceptional circumstance. It was only ever when there was no other way of getting information, because this bill would allow children to spy on their parents and have that relationship. So it's just quite a lot of things when you get into it. It's really quite worrying. Again, that was one that's probably the first one where I started working across the House with members of the House of Lords, and there's some brilliant, Bevan Kidron, absolute legend, and Lord Simon Russell as well, and Lord George Young. Now, again, if you'd have told my 15-year-old self that George Young, who is a former Conservative government minister, he's a really interesting guy, and he was really agreed with us that it was important to protect children. So we all worked together to formulate proposals and legislation, and to win that battle back and forth between the Commons and the Lords to get it into the bill. And now the bill has an explicit protection for children, that it's only in exceptional circumstances, and that there have to be appropriate adults involved to be able to protect their welfare. And it, you know, it's one of those things we will see in time. The figures are only published every couple of years about how many children are asked to do this. But in having that conversation, we were able also to hold the police and the secret services to account, and to get them out of the mindset that this child was involved in criminal behaviour, so it was okay. You know, first and foremost, they need to be seen as a child. And we've got more work to do to follow up in terms of the codes of conduct and guidance. But, you know, 6 months ago when we started, there was nothing. And now that's a massive part of that piece of legislation. So it does take time, and it takes raising awareness, and it takes having proposals, because often what people will say is, well, what would you do then? And you have to be able to answer that question. But it is possible to get these things to move. And I'm proud of that, because I feel like some very vulnerable children will have support that they wouldn't have had we not acted together to do that.
Oh, I think it's very important. I want to talk to you about protesting generally, because obviously we've had Black Lives Matter, and then we had the Sarah Everard vigils, and there seems to be such a strong effort right now to curb people from going out and protesting, which is a human right, really. What's your feeling about that? Because there's bills going through all the time, and I find them horrific.
I've spoken out on the policing bill that's currently going through Parliament, because I think not only is it very dangerous in a democracy to say, well, I don't want to hear what you have to say. Absolutely, you know, it's a bit like free speech. It's not an unqualified right. You don't have a right to shout fire in a crowded theatre and not take responsibility for what happens. So absolutely, the way in which you protest needs to be peaceful. It needs to be democratic protest. You know, I draw a distinction between those people who protest to intimidate and silence others, and those people who protest to be able to speak up. But those are boundaries that we can draw. I mean, to give you an example of how this bill is it's unworkable more than anything. Whether you think it's right to challenge protesters or not, the bill talks about serious annoyance as a guidance for when you can shut down a protest. Now, I have to be honest, Lynn, there are lots of things that seriously annoy me, but you know, sometimes you're Scooby-Doo and sometimes you're Larry David in terms of your levels of what annoys you. The idea that that's going to be a test that we ask the police to apply and then we hold them to account for it, you know, that's an impossible test for any police officer to be, you know, what's one person's serious annoyance is another person's important point being made. So logically, it just doesn't work.
Well, I was just interested to see all the big protests about outside the football clubs that didn't seem to be stopped at all by all the fans. And yet, again, at these events to reclaim the streets, how that seemed to bring up so much anger.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, look, I have tried to do a lot of work with the Met Police because I have very real concerns with how the Met address violence against women and their engagement more generally with misogyny. What we've won to date is that from the autumn, the police will have to record instances of crimes which are motivated by hostility towards sex or gender, because there are a quarter of police forces in this country already doing that. and it's helping to piece together where women are at risk, but the Met is not one of them. The next stage of this is to get it into the court system so that you can then recognise an aggravated sentence, because it's a form of hate crime. But what I think you saw with Sarah Everard, and I was really concerned when I read the report that the police did into it, and they said this justifies the approach that we took. It worked on the basis that there was no other form of action that could have happened. So even though you had some incredibly seasoned organisers and campaigners looking to organise that vigil and to have it socially distanced and have thought about how to make it happen, they decided that those women didn't know what they were doing, and so they had to step in. And in stepping in, they took away the idea that there was any other way in which that could have been managed, that whether you'd had stewards there on the evening and community engagement, you could have asked people to leave in a way that would have been more ordered. And I think, for me, there are questions that remain about how the police engage with community groups and protests, because they see everybody as one lumped together. But actually, we know that if you are the BNP, you will get a lot of attention and they will find ways to facilitate you. What we saw with the Sarah Everard vigil was a dismissal of the experience of the organisers that I think was mistaken. And that culture needs to change within the police.
The other thing I wanted to talk to you about was, of course, the fact that at the time of recording this, the figures you put out yesterday, where there were 18 more women have been killed on the streets since Sarah Everard, which is a shocking figure. Well, not all on the street.
More women, and
murdered.
I think for us, that's why we are so determined. Look, there's always a point when suddenly people become aware of an issue and it becomes a national debate. And the responsibility of all of us is to take that moment and turn it into something concrete, because we know those moments are few and far between. That's really hard to do. You have to move from having an analysis to answers, and you have to be prepared to work with people to make them happen. Because it's really easy in politics to hold out for a storm. So, you can have a couple of days of bad headlines and then people move on. To actually get something to change means you have to say to people, it's not enough that you agree with me that something should be done. Here's the thing that should be done. Do you agree that should happen? And one of the challenges I always make to all campaign organisations, and I would say this in particular, I'm really worried about our climate. There's a massive climate crisis going on. The challenge to organisations like Extinction Rebellion is to move us from an analysis that says this is an urgent nightmare to, and these are the things that we can do. Because otherwise, all politicians will stand and say, yes, there's a climate emergency. Yes, it's really important that we act, but we won't get any meaningful change. And following Sarah Everard's death, the government was put under scrutiny about, well, what are you doing to keep women safe? And they would say things like, well, yes, we recognise this is a problem. And then they came up with this idea about having police in nightclubs or CCTV, as if it was about whether women should go out at night rather than women are at risk wherever.
I saw the street light one. I mean, yes, it's there's so much that can be done, and I think it's coming up with the appropriate solutions. That's for sure, because they are not there at the moment.
But you can drive, and where protest gets it right is where it moves. It creates the space for that solution to come forward. So if I think about something like Jubilee 2000, where millions of people took to the streets, people were protesting in their communities, but it created the space about cancelling debt, because cancelling debt was a solution. And actually, what was so powerful about those experiences is people could see the consequence of their campaigning leading to real change. So they thought that change was important to make happen. I worry at the moment that we're collapsing into, well, let's just make a fuss and say, this isn't my idea, but not saying, but what should happen instead?
Yes.
And for me, I do this job not because I want to sit on the green benches and make the same speech 3 different ways, or even go to nice lunches, or even have people tell me I'm lovely and have a photo taken with me saying I care about the same things as them. I want to see meaningful change. And I feel as impatient as I was as a 15-year-old for that to happen. And that sometimes means having the difficult conversations about what can we do, rather than just saying, well, somebody shouldn't have done that. Because if we don't do that, it's just people get off the hook. It's really easy to take someone off the hook.
I completely agree. I mean, we have to have the solutions, and we have to have the visions, and the visions have to be based on our values. And for me, that's what politics are about. And whether the current political system in its own way can really come up with those solutions, I have huge doubts myself. I think there's ways that it will come back to community. It should come back to community. And I hope and believe women will take a leadership role in those communities to create this vision of how it can be.
Yeah, I have to believe that the political sphere can be that process, but I know it has to change. Yes. a lot of my day, I could just be a prop in people's photographs. I get asked to go to meetings where someone wants to brief me, and I think, well, I learned to read when I was a little kid. So if you just want me to read something, that's great. If you want to have a conversation about how we change this, that's a different kettle of fish. Or I get asked if I will sign something that looks like, it's like parliamentary graffiti, to say something should be done. And I always try and say to people, ask more. Don't let's do the things that let people off the hook. Let's ask more, and then you do your bit too. Because I say, I'm one person in Hogwarts. You know, if like with the stalking register, it really now needs people across this country to speak up and say, hang on a minute, if women are still dying because we're not monitoring these people, then rather than asking women to do this, why aren't we asking the police to do that? And the only way that happens is there's a dedicated list that they are accountable for. That, you know, everybody can use, whether it is social media or speaking to their MP, because every MP is going to have a vote on it on Monday. So there's a really clear moment where change can happen. But I am one voice in that. And admittedly, I will lobby my colleagues. But if they get lobbied by people in their communities, if people are talking about it nationally, that makes it a completely different proposition. And that's something we can all be part of. I get the idea that I'm something special because I'm an MP. I just have a different platform to the one that you have. But everybody can use their platform.
Yeah, well, that's in fact the question I was going to ask you. Was the next question is coming towards the end now, is what advice would you give to people wanting to reconnect with their communities? You know, what can we do? I mean, lobbying our MP is clearly part of it. I also think that, you know, making a statement, if you think about the whole country going outside their front doors at one time to clap for the NHS, why aren't we going outside our front door and making a statement that way if we don't want to go on marches? There are many, many ways we can do things, and I believe that we should, and taking action in whatever way we can. So what ways would you say that, other than, of course, lobbying our MPs, we can actually make a change in our communities, even from a local perspective?
I always work from what I call the AAA perspective, which is, first of all, you have to have answers, not just analysis. So you can't just say the world is unfair, someone should do something about it. I'm going to go and tell that MP, that councillor, my local neighbourhood group, somebody should, I'm going to come up with some answers. And that is scary, because it's putting your head above a parapet. The second thing I would say is that in that process, you need to build allies, not just props. So, you know, the point about the props is like, everyone sit in the meeting and agree with me is not the same as what can we do together. I went and lobbied Jacob Rees-Mogg about the abortion stuff. Now, I know Jacob feels very strongly, completely differently to me, but there were points at which the government was trying to use parliamentary procedure back when Jacob was a backbencher, that I thought, well, we would agree that this isn't right. I didn't manage to convince him, but I'm really glad I went and tried, because if finding allies with people is always about, you know, not being frightened to speak to somebody and show them that you have the respect of thinking that they could help. And you'd be amazed in a local community who else can help. Absolutely. I mean, as an MP, I have very little power. I don't run my local council. I don't have any pots of money to spend on things. Especially as a backbench opposition MP, I don't control the government agenda. So really, I have much less power than, say, a local councillor would, or maybe a local business or a local school would, or a local hospital. Go and talk to them, see if you can convince them to be part of what you can do. And then finally, you need actions, not agitation. So what do I mean by that? You know, agitation, and a lot of politics now, people start angry and then they ask you a question. And you're like, that's just emotionally, that's quite hard. You know, I always used to, when I was able to do community groups meetings together, I always make sure there's a cup of tea and a biscuit, because I think people make bad decisions, behave badly towards each other if they're hangry. So actions come not from winding people up, but actually being open to, well, okay, we might disagree, but what can we agree on? And can we agree that we should write to somebody and let them know about it? Agitation is, I'm going to stop the traffic and just expect you to understand why that's happening. Actions are, actually, if we car share, we can cut the amount of pollution in our local community. So it's thinking about the actions that you can take that would make people want to take them with you. And that includes members of parliament, includes councillors, includes people who are probably trying their best. You know, most MPs, most councillors, most political representatives are good people who care about this country, care about the communities. That's why they do what they do. But they're quite frazzled. They're trying to deal with a system that's quite bureaucratic and out of date, and they can't do everything. So if you help them think about the actions they can take that will help you, because you're taking action yourself, you're the one going and talking to the hospital, you're the one going and talking to local school kids about maybe what they could do to remove single-use plastics from their local community. It's completely different from an agitated kind of, right, well, we're demanding a meeting with you, we've got a to-do list for you, and why haven't you done it immediately? Like, just emotionally thinking about that and how people will work together. What's brilliant about it is if you think in those three ways, having an answer, having allies, and having actions, you build relationships that don't just help you solve one issue, they start changing all sorts of things. As you and I have been.
That's really, yeah.
You and I met over one issue, but we've continued to work together and collaborate, because I hope you found it a positive and constructive experience, because it's like, here's where I need your help, and actually, can I help you? And can we show people that it is possible to change things, because then it's even more worth being part of what we're doing.
Yes, and that absolutely works. And in my own little town, in our own little council, it's unbelievable how you get these different oppositions. It's not even arguing about policies or judgments about what we're doing in the town. It ends up just being people against people. And I don't understand it myself, but I find
cup of tea and a biscuit, starting point.
I agree, a cup of tea and a biscuit. So I can hear the baby, so I know you've got to go. But I just want to ask you one last thing, which is really, what next, apart from having another baby, of course.
Well, and possibly taking the government to court over the fact that we don't have maternity cover for people in this country.
Yes.
I don't have confirmed maternity cover, and for my community, I want to make sure that they will see no difference if I'm away for 6 months with my second baby. I managed to get a locum for my first, but actually the only piece of legislation this government has passed in this pandemic to do with maternity has been about giving maternity cover to members of the cabinet. If members of parliament don't have proper maternity cover, how on earth can we fight for it for our constituents? And yet thousands of pregnant women have lost their jobs during the pandemic. Obviously, pregnant women, we still don't know properly whether they're going to be able to have the vaccine, although the government has now said they can. The logistics aren't there to deliver it in the way in which they need to do it. And, fighting for those issues and making sure that we don't forget women, and particularly we don't forget mothers in the pandemic who've borne the brunt of the redundancies so far, is so crucial, not just to our economy, but to our equality and our future potential as a country. So I've got 4 months until I give birth. And I've got a plan.
You've got it, of course you have.
Yeah, that we fight this because it will benefit everyone. We're one of the least productive countries in the G7. It's not by accident. We've got a big gender pay gap. We've got a big ethnic pay gap. The diversity issues are huge, and they hold us all back.
There is so much, and I get very depressed about government. And when I do get depressed, I feel one little light out there, and I think, but Stella Creasy is there, and I really mean that. Yeah. And what you do, Stella, is just extraordinary, fantastic. I want to thank you on behalf of myself and everybody that benefits from the hard work you do, particularly for women. I'm very grateful that you had time today to join me. I'm with you every step of the way. Anytime you want any collaboration from me and putting the word out there, I'm there 100%. So
I'm just one cog. There is a whole army, and in fact, it's an army.
I'd like to believe it, but I have met a lot of the others. I mean, there are some wonderful women in government, particularly women, actually, I have to say, strong women, and have been over the years. Fantastic. Harriet Harman, Yvette Cooper.
Why do we expect women to be perfect? We're not one homogenous lump.
We're not perfect, but we are nurturing, and we do care, and many of us are mothers, and if we're not mothers, we're daughters and sisters. And there's something about the way the women do politics and our leaders that I can see it with myself, and my heart comes from the heart far more. It's just the way it is. It's not about power, and I hope this new paradigm of a more feminine-led way of doing things, whether it's gender-based or whether it's just a change of coming from the heart instead of from the head or the wallet, is going to be the future. That's got to be the future, really. That's how I see the new future that we can make now. So.
I think we have to change to put compassion at the heart of how we work. I would say that women are as capable as men of promoting the alternative. That, I mean, I have to be honest, in the direct the direct discrimination I faced as a mum in terms of my political career, and people now telling me that I can't take on leadership positions, that I can't cope with things anymore, has come from women.
Oh, I hate it when I hear that.
Which is really frustrating.
There are some awful women in your world too. And, you know, we have to learn. We have to really learn and understand about the sisterhood, that there is a need for it. We've had 2,000 plus years of being subdued and subjugated, and it is time for us women to come together. And the women that you're talking about, on the whole, or the women I'm talking about, tend to feel that they have to behave in this old masculine paradigm way to get on, and they need to come out into the modern world and breathe the air and see what's really going.
I was always fascinated by Margaret Thatcher's diaries, because she wrote about when in the 1970s, when she was in the shadow cabinet for the Conservatives, so before she became Prime Minister, and she was the only woman, and she used to write about being annoyed that she was asked to speak for all women. And I thought that was fascinating, because I completely get that. I mean, you know, I couldn't possibly speak for all the women in my constituency, because they are an incredibly diverse, talented bunch with all sorts of different experiences. My job is to create them a platform for them, as it is for the men in my constituency, so that you can see what they're capable of and learn from it. But we will make progress when we stop expecting one woman to be every woman. You know, I love it when the government appoints a lady. And I always think of it as the lady vote in things. And it's like, yeah, there you go. That's women covered off. As though 51% of the population all think with one mind. A bit like the scene in the film Witches. You know, you get us all in a room. We'll all take off our masks, and actually we're all part of some secret cabal with secret wording and secret intention. Like,
of course, I believe we are. A lot of people.
Well, yeah, you know, maybe we should start saying that, because then they might think,
I love saying,
I don't want to upset them. Who knows what spells they might cast?
I totally admit to being a witch. That's one of the reasons I live in Somerset. I flew here on my broomstick, no doubt about it. But anyway, it's been so lovely to talk to you. Thank you so much. Give that baby of yours a big kiss from me. And let's hope we meet up at some time in the not too distant future. And good luck with the pregnancy. Love you lots. And
thank you.
Fantastic. Congratulations for everything you're doing. God bless you. Bye-bye. I'd now like to introduce the exercise of getting involved in your community. There's so many ways we can do this, whether it's volunteering at your local food bank, finding a community garden to be involved in, or even getting in touch, as Stella suggests, with your own MP to tell them what changes you'd like to see in your area. Have a think about where you would like to put your energy and where you can make some changes. I'd love to share your stories and hear about them. So why not get in touch with me at Seed Women with Lynne Franks on Facebook or on Instagram, and let me know how you have become a change maker in your own community. Thank you so much for listening. I would love you to subscribe to this podcast, rate it and review it. Also, make sure you join our Seed network if you haven't already, and join the thousands of like-minded women where you can make friends, promote your businesses, and share your stories. Visit seednetwork.com and find out more. So join us in 2 weeks' time on Frankly Speaking with Lynne Franks. Bye.